Hey everyone, welcome to Judging for the Win. I'm Dave, and this is my daily ruling. Today is this month's patron pick. Thank you so much to all of my wonderful supporters on Patreon. The topic that was chosen this month is Judge Tower. Now, I actually had a video on this channel once where I played Judge Tower with a couple of my colleagues. I'll leave a link in the description, but that's not what we're doing today. The patron who suggested this topic specifically requested a breakdown of how to run Judge Tower, so I'll be covering that this time around. First off, the rule set I'll share here is pretty representative of what I've seen from playing this format with others, but it's not like there's a rules committee working on standardizing this, so you might see some variations. The general concept is always the same though. Players must take any game action as soon as they are legally allowed to, leading to wacky game states and complicated stacks. The other format-specific rules are meant to facilitate this. First up, players all share a single library and graveyard. The shared library could be a stack of whatever bulk happens to be lying around, but it's commonly a curated set of cards maintained by one of the players. I'll get to a discussion of what types of cards tend to lead to fun interactions later in the video. Players are considered to own any card that they personally draw or otherwise put into play from that library. Originally, when I played this, we had the shared library, but I experimented with giving each player their own individual graveyard. This made it easier to keep track of which player owned each card. I've decided to embrace the shared graveyard both to sync it up with other formats like Dan Dan, and also because it makes cards like Raise Dead more interesting. Next, each player's starting hand size is reduced. There's a lot going on in this game, and drawing 7 cards right out of the gate is a pretty big disadvantage for whoever's going first. I usually see 0 cards as the starting hand size, though I endorse using this number as a handicap, for example by giving 1 or maybe 2 cards to the player who won the last round or to anyone who is otherwise proven to have a high level of rules knowledge and or a thirst for a challenge. Next, like I mentioned before, you have to take every game action as soon as you're legally allowed to. This includes casting spells, activating abilities, attacking, blocking, you get the idea. Often people include choosing optional modes of spells or choosing to do the maximum number of actions with cards that have you may or up to templates. But I prefer to instead manage this by curating the deck list and allowing people to make legal, ordinarily nonsensical plays with these cards when they come up, such as returning 0 cards with an All Sun's Dawn. To help out with the action, each player also has infinite mana of each type and infinite life. Here's a fun fact. According to the rules, each player needs to say how much mana they have in their mana pool every time they pay a cost and also every time they pass priority. I recommend modifying these rules to release players from this for obvious reasons. Demonstrating knowledge of obscure CR rules is kind of the point of the format though, so I like making people call it at least one time before suspending these obligations. Because mana is limitless, most X spells and abilities require some sort of a cap to function sensibly. When I learned Judge Tower, the rule was X always equals 3, but I've heard some groups like X equals 5 instead. In the same way, activated abilities also require a limit. When I play, all activated abilities have a rider that says, activate this ability only once per turn on them. There's one more stipulation that was added to make abilities play better. Normally, when you have a choice between taking 2 different game actions, such as whether to play 1 card in your hand or another, you can choose either one. But take a look at this Castle Lochthwain. Do you think anyone is ever activating the draw card ability of this card? Not if they can help it. To keep people from bypassing otherwise interesting cards like this, anytime a card has multiple abilities that can be activated, you must activate the bottommost one first. I like extending this rule to allow for some more variation. For example, take a look at this Chandra Flamecaller. Based on what we just talked about, the only possible way to play this card is to activate the -X ability every turn, since it's legal to choose 0 for X. This situation can be fixed by requiring players to cycle through all of the abilities, not repeating one until they've chosen all of the others. By this time, I imagine you're probably wondering how you win a game where players have infinite life and a shared library. Well, as you may have surmised, the normal Magic win conditions are immaterial. The real winner is the person who can manage to navigate the gameplay while not breaking any game rules. Some rule sets have players immediately lose the game anytime they're caught doing something against the rules. I prefer using a point system, where each infraction loses you a life, and the bragging rights either go to the player with the most lives left at the end of the deck, or else the last one standing after all the players have lost a set number of lives. This can also be used to handicap players of varying skill levels. Now, although calling a judge is not against the rules in any circumstance, I think the game does flow a little bit better if you penalize crying wolf, in other words, incorrectly accusing an opponent of breaking the rules. Perhaps this scenario might allow the innocent player to transfer one of their shame points to the accuser. And while the honor system generally works pretty well for this format, I also like playing with all the hands revealed, which allows players to call out rule breaking that otherwise might remain hidden. More on this in the next section. And that's it. Now you know how to play Judge Tower. If you'd like to get a feel for what the gameplay is like, check out the description for a link to the video I mentioned earlier with actual footage of me playing Judge Tower with some of my colleagues. Unfortunately, you're not ready to play just yet. You need to have an actual Judge Tower to do that. Now, you don't need to put a ton of thought into this. Like I mentioned before, you can use whatever random cards you happen to have lying around, and a challenging game will ensue. But if you're going to be doing this a lot, I recommend creating a deck list, which lets you trim out cards that have unfun play patterns. Like Dan, there isn't really a definitive consensus deck list, although there are some published lists online that you can use as a starting point. The good news for anyone looking to put together a Judge Tower is that a lot of the most interesting cards are bulk rares, which means you can pick them up pretty cheap. You also don't have to feel bad if you decide to issue some errata to any of them with a permanent marker to make them play better. Another great thing about this format is it's by definition not a competitive endeavor, so if availability is a concern, it's pretty unlikely that anyone will get upset if you print out a card that you want to include on a piece of paper and slip it into a sleeve. In fact, this might actively be a good idea if you're dealing with a card that has material differences between its current Oracle text and any of its available physical printings. I'll take some time here to recommend a few cards I think make for some fun interactions. First up, here's Teferi's Imp. There's a couple of great things about this card. First off, you need to know how phasing works. Due to the recent reintroduction of this mechanic in the form of cards like Slip Out the Back, most players have probably encountered the concept of phasing in and out, but the actual phasing mechanic itself has not been printed on a card during the lifetime of many Magic players, which means that some of the subtleties around how it works are unfamiliar. Did you know that phasing in and out officially happens before you untap for the turn? This means that the triggered abilities on this card actually triggered during your untap step. No player gets priority during the untap step though, which means that those triggered abilities do not go on the stack until the upkeep. In addition to having a couple of interesting rules interactions, the ability to give players some card selection is pretty good from a gameplay perspective, because this is a game where most cards are a liability, so getting to discard is a particularly big win if you can get rid of an egregious one. Another card in a similar vein is something like this. Since it's probable that most of your creatures will be legendary, the chances that bands with other legendary creatures will come up is pretty high, even if it only affects one color. Fun fact, it is legal for all of your legendary creatures to attack in a single band together, even if only one of them has bands with other legends. For this and more information on how banding works, check out my dedicated video on the topic. Next up here is Dead Ringers. A lot of players have found this card notoriously difficult to parse, so just understanding what's going on is a little bit of a struggle. I'm told that this is such an issue that the foreign language versions of this card, which were printed later, actually have reminder text that explains how it's supposed to work. Unfortunately, I couldn't verify this since Scryfall and Gather don't have scans, but if you have a picture of a version of this card with reminder text, I would love to see it. You could send it via Discord or by emailing dave@judgingftw.com. Now, the real beauty of this card is that the only targeting restriction is that both the creatures have to be non-black. Casting it targeting a red creature and a blue-red creature is totally fine. The spell just won't do anything when it resolves. Like I said before, having creatures is generally a liability, so if a player is able to cast the spell targeting two creatures that are exactly the same color or colors, that's generally a big win. Following along with this is Jinxed Idol. In a game where there's infinite mana and repeatable card advantage on many of the permanents, having a safety valve like this can keep things from spiraling too far out of control. This one is nice because you target the opponent, meaning that you can choose how frequently people get to sacrifice in a multiplayer game. If you don't like politics, you could try something that just has everybody sacrifice all at once, like Braids or Smokestack. This sort of card can be good because they also raise the question of what order everybody sacrifices in. Check out my video on Crack the Earth versus Show and Tell if you're interested in this topic. Now, another card that's good for testing people's understanding of official ordering is Vision Skeins. Because the library is shared, the specific order in which the cards are drawn is significant, unlike in normal Magic. I talked about another situation where this ordering matters in my video on Laboratory Maniac and Wheel of Fortune. Another card that's good for testing what happens when you draw is Thunderous Wrath. The Miracle mechanic gives this card an extra complication. It's not generally possible to cast Thunderous Wrath via its Miracle cost, because in this format, the card is an instant, meaning it's legal to cast Thunderous Wrath in response to the triggered ability from Miracle that lets you cast it for its Miracle cost. Now, Since all the cards have to be played as soon as legally possible, I think it makes some sense to have a few cards in the mix that are not possible to cast without a little bit of help. So maybe like the Stifle here. There are a lot of activated and triggered abilities, so it will certainly be playable eventually, but it's also possible for it to stick around in your hand for a while. Hex is another card that gets points for this metric. Finally, Eater of Days amuses me to no end at Judge Tower. Because of the peculiarities of the format, the card gets turned completely on its head, with the benefit of its high power and toughness compared to its mana cost being completely inconsequential, whereas the drawback of getting to skip 2 turns becomes a valuable asset. Such a reversal does a great job of making things a little bit more fun. You could also throw in a few Chaos cards, because based on what I've seen online, there's 2 main camps of people who are interested in Judge Tower. Those who like it for the ability to build crazy complicated board states, and those who are interested in its potential value as a teaching or evaluation tool for mentorship. If you belong to the former camp, something like Warp World or Scrambleverse might be right up your alley. If not, one of the great things about this format is that you can curate the experience to your liking, and if that leaves a couple of the wackiest options on the bench, well, so be it. I will give a word of caution to those who are interested in the format for its pedagogical value, which is that, in my opinion, that value isn't very high. Judge Tower does a good job of testing knowledge of timing and priority, but not much else. Even if you include cards that are intended to raise questions about other rules topics, it's hard to say whether any specific interaction will come up, especially since an interaction generally involves 2 or more specific cards. A better way to bring out this knowledge is to manipulate for it. If you're looking to test knowledge of interactions, there's no special reason why those interactions need to come up in organic gameplay. My long-term viewers might have noticed that it's generally pretty easy to guess what interaction I'm going to be covering in a video just by looking at the cards pictured in the thumbnail, because if you know what those cards do, it's generally pretty suggestive of a question. This is the basic operating principle behind a mentoring tool judges have used for decades, known as the Judge Box. Pick 2 or 3 cards that raise an interesting question, put them together in a sleeve, and present them to your mentee with a brief explanation if necessary. You can help organize your Judge Box by using different designs of sleeves, for example by color-coding the sleeves based on difficulty or rules topics. If you'd like to give the Judge Box a try, I've left a link to my colleague Judge Min's box, which he's actively maintained for several years now. Of course, this is a great starting point, but like Judge Tower, the Judge Box is a tool that's best used not with a simple copy and paste, but when it's thoughtfully curated based on what experience you want to provide and what cards you have available. But that's all I have for you today. Thank you again to all of my lovely supporters on Patreon. Join me again next time for another Daily Ruling. Until then, I hope you have a great day.